Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this very special Orcas event presented by the San Juan Islands Museum of Art. My name is Diane Martindale, and I'm the president of the SJIMA board. I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors. First and foremost is the Orcas Island Community Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, Washington State Arts Commission, the Honeywell Charitable Fund, and KCTS Channel 9. Before we begin the program, I'd like to thank the staff at the Orcas Center, Susan Singleton, a member of our advisory board, and Mark Kyle for their assistance leading up to this moment. Today's SJIMA event is the first live streaming event we've ever done, and we welcome all of those of you who are enjoying this talk from afar. From the wings, you will have noticed that the last of our speaker series, Ask Us About Afghanistan, is coming this Wednesday, August 31st at 7 p.m. at the San Juan Community Theater. Paths to Understanding Afghanistan unites Reverend Terry Kylo in dialogue with James Longley. Reverend Kylo is a Lutheran pastor and executive director of Paths to Understanding, a multi-faith peacemaking organization. Longley is Friday Harbor's Oscar-nominated filmmaker and photographer. The event is pay as you can, and no reservations are necessary. Looking into Kabul is on exhibit until September 12th, Thursday through Monday, 11 to 5, and special summer hours, Thursday through Saturday, 7 to 9. So please come enjoy this dazzling show. Today we present Personal Stories of Everyday Life by James Longley. In his own words, you will learn about the culture and everyday life in Afghanistan, leading you to a better understanding of this ancient and troubled region. Now let's discover what it's like to live in Afghanistan. James, welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you.
All right. I hope we'll have a pretty informal discussion. And it's true that I can't see you, but I hope that if in the course of this talk, if any of you have questions or something that you feel should be said, that you will shout it out and not be shy. Normally, I don't give very many slide presentations. Normally, if I'm speaking to public, it's after a film screening, and it's the question and answer period, and that's really what I'm most comfortable with. So for me, it would be fine to have a 2-hour question and answer, but since we haven't seen anything yet, maybe I'll start with slides. I wanted to talk a little bit about Afghanistan. It's a place that now I've spent 4 years of my life in. I was in Afghanistan from 2011 until 2015. And then just recently, I came back from Afghanistan a week ago after spending 6 months from February until just a week ago. So I'm getting to the point now where I feel pretty comfortable talking about Afghanistan as a subject, although I must say that even after 4 years, it's not enough to even really scratch the surface of a country like Afghanistan, because it's a really complicated place with many different tribes, many different languages spoken, and it's not one coherent story that you can easily tell. Prior to being in Afghanistan, I was in some neighboring countries. I was in Pakistan for a year, between 2009 and 2011, and before that I was in Iran for a year from 2007 until 2009 when I and all the other foreign journalists were asked to leave after the Green Uprising in 2009, which is around the Iranian election at that time. Before that, I was in Iraq for 2 years. I spent a lot of time in Egypt, in Turkey, and the Gaza Strip for 4 months. I made a film in the Gaza Strip as well. It was my first foray into sort of West Asian affairs. And prior to that, I had been in Russia, and I'd studied film in Moscow at the Film Institute, and I lived in Russia for about 4.5 years, I guess. The last time I was there was maybe now already 12 years ago. Recently I was talking to a friend of mine in Russia who's a really nice guy from a steel town in Siberia. He's an artist. He designs characters for video games. And we were on Signal talking on video chat, and I was in Kabul. And he was saying, James, don't you support us Russians in our fight with Ukraine? You like us, and don't you think we're right to be fighting this war in Ukraine? And don't you think we've been forced into it? And it occurred to me that, and he said, you're just missing the information about this war. And I said, you don't have in Russia even one newspaper or television channel who's permitted to speak openly about this conflict. And maybe you're the one who's missing some information about what's going on. But it occurred to me that that all of us in these countries like China and Russia and even the United States, in a way we are kind of trapped in our media. Our vision is limited by what we can really see with our media, and also nobody wants to think that that they're living in a country that does bad things, or they're somehow part of some ill adventure, like the Russians' war in Ukraine. Like the Russians don't want to believe, I mean most of them, that they're doing anything wrong. And I think the United States has similar problems in our understanding of our activities around the world sometimes, like our war in Iraq, and similarly our war in Afghanistan, which I think a lot of people supported, including almost all of our elected officials. And yet, it turned out to be a very bad idea in the end. It all ended badly. And I think Americans are somehow, we're often surprised by these outcomes because we're told that these are all necessary things and that we can easily accomplish them. And I think in reality, things are different. In the same way that Russians can't really see what their country is doing in Ukraine, the United States, like we were also, during our 20-year war in Afghanistan, really unable to see what we were doing in the country. And that's become more and more clear to me, especially in these last 6 months, because in the last 6 months, it's been possible, when I was there under the new Taliban government, it's not a great government, but one thing that is different from before, in a positive way, is that there isn't any big war going on in the country. And now it's possible, whereas it used to be impossible, it's possible now to drive around Afghanistan and actually see the country, because there's security, there's no war, there's no fighting, there's only fighting really in one province up in Panjshir. And that's about it. And for the most part, Afghanistan is quite peaceful now, and you can drive around. It's really strange. Like in the past, when I was there under the previous government with the war, it was too dangerous. It was too dangerous even to drive 45 kilometers into the next province and visit a village in Maidan Wardak, or some neighboring province to Kabul. That was already far too dangerous for a Westerner to do, because those areas were already under the control of the Taliban, and the United States and NATO in those areas, even next to Kabul, was so unpopular that as a Westerner, the chances were high that you could be killed or kidnapped or something will happen to you. But now, it's completely different, and the war is over. And now, after the United States' 20-year conflict in Afghanistan. We think that we've pulled our military out, and now our engagement with Afghanistan is over, but that's not really the case, and that's kind of why I'm happy to do a talk like this and discuss it, because the United States is still, of course, heavily involved in Afghanistan. We are the largest donor to Afghanistan. We remain the largest donor in Afghanistan. And also, we are the country that has the most sanctions against Afghanistan. We don't recognize Afghanistan, which stops other countries also from recognizing the government in Afghanistan. And we have, as you know, probably, we've frozen the foreign currency reserves of Afghanistan, which are held in the United States. And so that, combined with stopping the aid to Afghanistan from the IMF and the World Bank, means that, in combination with the general incompetence of the Taliban government, that the economy in Afghanistan is pretty much completely frozen now. So although we are no longer fighting I guess what they call a hot war in Afghanistan, we're fighting a different kind of war now, where, having given power to the Taliban under the Trump and Biden administrations, we are now saying, okay, we've given you power, we've left the country and left you in charge, but we're not going to recognize your government, and we're going to freeze your economy. And I think this is really a bad choice for the United States going forward. And I would like to discuss it. Anyway, in the meantime, I want to show you some pictures from Afghanistan. This is me in 2012 when I was just starting to film. And over here on the left is Jamshid Amiri, my trusty sound guy that I worked with. Jamshid is now, he's been living in a hotel in northern Macedonia for the past year with his family. And I think in about a week or two, he's going to fly to Toronto, Canada, and he's going to become a Canadian citizen. And pretty much everyone I worked with on the film that I made there is now out of the country. They're in Germany, they're in Macedonia, they're in the UK, and they're here in the United States. There's almost no one left. That's a whole other side of the Afghanistan story, of course, the people who are trying to get out and have already left Afghanistan. But I think the bigger picture is going to be the 38 million people who remain in Afghanistan, the ordinary citizens who really have no way of leaving the country. My film that we made there over those 3 years is really about them. There isn't anyone in my film who has left the country. They're all still there. So to me, that says, in a way, that I chose the demographic of the people in the film correctly for what I was trying to do, which was show a kind of ordinary life for ordinary people. It's not quite true, actually. There is one kid, like this kid's older brother. He's now in Turkey, for example, and another one of the kids I filmed is in Iran. But nobody got on the plane and was able to leave the country from the people in my film. They're all sort of stuck there like ordinary people. So it really was a film about the sort of the ordinary Afghan person. And I'll show you a clip of it. I think if we can maybe lower the lights and crank the sound, I'll show you just a clip from the middle of the film, a few minutes. Let's see if I can, make sure that this is going to play. Yes, I think, so I filmed this, it was 200 filming days, actually, between 2012 and 2015. And the transcript of the movie wound up being 8,000 pages. It was this tremendous amount of work. The whole idea was to make a kind of three-dimensional
یک انفجارات چیزی شد مردم جف برآمده نمیتن از خانه خود.
نبی لازم دستی؟ چی میکنی؟ فوتبال میکنی؟ تو نبی بلا بازی
If you could have a bit more sound.
یا تو طرف
چند خونیست؟
آره پرسانش که چند تا
چند است رستم؟ یک کلگونی
ما شما در دست گذشته خوانید که ما ایمان داریم و ملائکه. درست؟ و چی ایمان داریم؟ ملائکه رو که از چی ساخته شده؟ از نور ساخته شده. گفتیم که آنها
فرشته از نور هستند. ایره خداوند جل جلاله مقرر کرده که
Sorry.
ما دیده نمیتونیم
Adjust the sound a little bit.
که اگر در زمین تاشم مثل ما چیری خود نشان نمیتن
Slightly, yeah.
مثل ما ور چیری در یک انسان مدرایه.
Unit 5, lesson 1. Past tense of be. Past tense of be. بودم چه رقم میگیری؟ I was a student in 1393. میشه. Your friend is gonna talk about Sardar Muhammad Dawood Khan.
In the name of Allah, Sardar Muhammad Dawood Khan, he was as born in 1909. Born in 1909, and he was president of Afghanistan, and died in 1978.
نصایح بزرگان که خوانده بود درست.
دستگاه تلویزیون با روان در کشور عزیز افغانستان در اواخر سال 1356 ایزی شمسی در زمان جمهوریت
سردار محمد داوود خان
و فعالیت آغاز کرد که در آنگاه تنها مردم
در علم کی دور میکرد که در افغانستان داود خان از بین میره، خاندان زایدی سلطنتی از بین میره، در خو کی میگشت. در علم که از دور نمیکرد.
بنیاد ظلم در جهان اول اندکی بوده است. هر که آمد بر او
مزید کرد
تا
بدین غایت
رسید.
انسان که سر ظلم آدم اندک بگیره تا آخر ظلم نمی باشه. مقصد از این پادشاه از این چیز بدن.
ترکی گپ میزد میگم ده خلق و خشم ده خدای قهر دی. راست است. اون با طوفان زد، طوفان انقلاب ترکی اون مردم داخل شدن حکومت ریاست جمهوری را وقت اعلام شد تیر کرده بدن که بیا که حکومت شاهی خلاص شد، جمهوری خلاص شد، انقلاب شد، در غریب است، اگر بیچاره است کلگی ها را به قدرت، به کار بار، به همه چیز میرسن. دنگ 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 دور دادن شروع شد، با جبر آمد از آن رست بدن. دختران کال حساب در جانش میکرد، بسیار مردم کال حساب در جانش میکردن، از تن میکردن. و مردم نان آرام تا فعلا نخوردن دیگه. همین بود که حفیظ لامین ترکی را خفا کرد کش خودش شد. حفیظ لامین خو نفر سیاهی بود. همون گفته بود که 1 میلیون من نگاه میکنم جوان دیگه کلش ختم میکنم دیگه ملت ختم میکرد. همین کشتن بستن بردن و زندان. مردم فرار شده کوه بلوش. روز داخل خاک افغانستان شد، دل خاک اشغال کرد. بعد از اینکه همین از بین رفت کارمل شد. اون دوری کارمل هم تیر شد، دوری امین هم تیر شد، دی ترکی هم شد. نجیب گرفت. گپ از گپ گذشته بود. مثل انار را شبلیدن کس داری موی غم کس را نخورد. این تا فعلا به میالت است.
خلیفه با من گفته میرفت بفهمی پشت این گریه بگی یا پشت درس تا بگی. او هم نکده قیاد نداره. در میدان دکان که میشیرم مردم خوب، مردم خراب یا بد را میبینم. یا زن یا مرد. چیزا رو میبینم. خداوند دیده نمیتونه. نه با قدرتش جمعیت. زمین، آسمان، کوها، دریاها، حیوانها، انسانها، کل چیز پیدا کرده. ما را پیدا کرده. در بالاست، ما در پایم. دو آسمان هاست. مرگ سر هر کس انسان است. مرگ آمدنی است. روز قیامت آمدنی است. هر چیز آمدنی است.
عید قربان به حقیقت ز خداوند کریم آفتابی به شب ظلمت انسان آمده.
برای ابراهیم میگه که ابراهیم دو نفری در یک قلب. خداوند میگه که ابراهیم فرزندت را برادر بسیار دوست داریش، حتی از خدا طرف کردی. دو نفر در یک قلب جاگزین نمیشه. ابراهیم فرزند را باید بکشید. ابراهیم فرزند نازدانه خود را به دستور پروردگار میگه خدایا تو میگه فرزند حیاتون خانواده ما نبودی ببرد زمین. پروردگار برش خورچی را روان کرد که باعث نجات فرزندشان شد.
پدرم اینقدر دوستم نداره. زیادتر این پدرم برادر خود ترکمه. اینقدر کور دوست دارم ولی دوست نداره.
That film, Angels Are Made of Light, is 2 hours long, and you can imagine watching the whole thing is like reading War and Peace or something. It's really a long documentary, and I think maybe because of that, it didn't really attract a lot of attention. It wasn't sold to anybody. No one bought the film. HBO and Netflix and Amazon and they all POV on PBS. They all looked at the film and passed, and they said we don't want to show this movie. It might have had something to do with the length, and it might have had something to do with the fact that in this film, the kids in the school, they're all saying things like, the war exists in our country because of the Americans, and if the Americans leave, then the war will be over. And they're saying things like, this government is corrupt and we don't like it, and we think this presidential election is fake, and this president is just being imposed on us. And all of these things which Americans didn't want to hear, whereas, other documentaries that had, I don't know, cute girls learning how to skateboard. There's a film called, Learning to Skateboard in Afghanistan, or If You're a Girl, which won the Oscar, And not to disparage the filmmakers, because I know that filmmaker. She's a lovely person, but it's not a real story about what was really happening in Afghanistan. I mean, it's, so I think that there is a certain gap between the narrative about Afghanistan that Americans expected to hear and really wanted to hear, and the narrative of what was actually happening in the country at that time. As I say, I think Americans were very surprised by the sudden fall, the collapse of their government, whereas I think Afghans were less surprised. They knew it was coming sooner or later. It was just a matter of time. So while I was making this film, on my days off, or when the sound guy would have a wedding in his family or something that he had to go to, I would go off and make these photographs of Kabul, and I would just walk around the city with with a Canon DSLR camera, and it all started out with these kind of single exposure photographs of these neighborhoods, especially in the old city of Kabul, which is where I was making my film. I started to just walk around these neighborhoods with a camera and like a student, a kid or something, as a guide, so that I wouldn't get in trouble. And I just started to make these photographs around, usually in the early morning or late in the afternoon, in the evening, around sunset, trying to catch this sort of magic hour. And this neighborhood especially I liked because it was this kind of working class neighborhood, and there weren't any of these kind of gaudy opium mansions of central Kabul. It was a lot more like the Kabul of the past. And also a lot more like the Afghanistan of other cities, smaller cities and villages. It was a lot more similar to that, just in terms of the things that people were doing, the activities, and the style of life, and the economic level was much more like the rest of the country. And so, because the security situation was such at that time that, as I mentioned, I could barely leave Kabul without getting into serious danger, I was looking for places that would allow me to show a kind of slice of Afghanistan life that would be representative of the largest possible, sort of in the center of the bell curve of Afghan demographics. And so, even though this is in the middle of Kabul, or pretty much in the middle of Kabul, it looks like it feels like the village a little bit, and it feels like the Kabul of the past. Which you can see these houses. They're made of mud brick houses with these logs for the roof structure. And while I was walking through these neighborhoods, I started to, people would come up to us and say, "What are you doing?" I'd say, "Photographing," and they say, "Take my picture." Especially boys. Lots of boys wanted to have their photograph taken. And especially after they discovered that we would take their picture, and then a few days later we would come back with prints, because in Afghanistan it's not so expensive to make prints, little prints, 5 by 7 inch prints of these photographs. So we would bring in these beautiful professional-looking prints for people and give them to them. So then, after that, everyone in these neighborhoods, they would see us coming, and they would sort of, it was difficult to get a clean shot because there's so many kids trying to get into the frame to have their photo taken. It was hard to get them to do it one at a time. And so I just started to take a lot of photographs, portraits of people, and that's kind of how I began working on photography there. This girl, she was a first grader in the school where I was filming, and this photograph it was for a German magazine. But most of the time I was just photographing just for myself. I wasn't really photographing for anyone else. I just thought, maybe one day, people would ask, what are you going to do with these pictures? And I said, maybe one day I'll have an exhibition or something like that. This woman on the left, she's a driving instructor. She was one of the only woman driving instructors in Afghanistan. And her portrait also I took for a magazine. It was, even at that time, I mean, we talk about now the Taliban is in power, and so women are really oppressed, and all of this, and it's true. But women were also oppressed under the previous government. Afghan culture, since the 1970s, has not been. In the 80s has not been great for women, especially since the takeover of the Mujahideen groups, followed by the Taliban, followed by these 20 years of war. Like in this period, from, you can say, the Soviet exit until now, things have been bad for Afghan women, I would say. I mean, embarrassing as it is to say it, I think sort of the peak for Afghan women was probably the Soviet period of the 80s. When women were a lot more independent and no one was forced to wear a hijab and so on, particularly in the cities, I think. But the government that we supported in Afghanistan from 2001 until 2021 was a government where the power was really in the hands mainly of warlords and war criminals, outright war criminals, who we were sort of forced by our policy to pay the salaries of. People like General Dostum, this self-named General Dostum, who would do things like put his prisoners of war into container trucks and bury them alive in the desert. He was the vice president of Afghanistan. So this boy on the left, he's a character in my film, Nabiullah. He is now in Istanbul, Turkey, trying to make his way to Europe, like so many others. His younger brother, who is also in one of those previous slides, he also, I think, is now about to follow his older brother. I think he's maybe 15, 16 years old. And, I see these kids there now in this neighborhood, who can't be more than 14, and they're telling me they're about to go alone, with human smugglers across Iran into Turkey, trying to make their way into Europe. This is, 1 million young people are now either already on this journey or about to make it out of Afghanistan. And it's really because of more than anything, because of the economic situation of Afghanistan. Now the war is over. As I mentioned, the security situation for most people there is completely fine, especially compared to how it was even a couple of years ago. But the problem is that there's food in the marketplace, but no one has money to buy it, really. No one has a job. And as I mentioned, the economy is frozen. So now most families, they need to have someone living in a foreign country with a source of income who can send money to them. Remittances now are the main source of income for most families in Afghanistan. This woman on the left, she was an interesting case. Another portrait I made for a magazine. You would never have the opportunity really to take portraits of women except if you have this excuse of doing it for a magazine or something else. Someone is coordinating it, and they know why you're taking it. Otherwise, they would be suspicious. Why do you want to take my picture? It would be somehow an invasion of privacy. Culturally, it was really difficult there to take pictures of women. And I think I only took the only time I took a picture of a young woman, someone 19, 20 years old, it was an Olympic athlete who was competing in the London 2012 Games as a sprinter from Afghanistan. She was the very first from her country to do so as a woman. And because of that, I was able to take her photograph, but that was considered a bit controversial. And I think it was CNN or BBC or something had gone to her house at one point to record an interview because she was about to go to the London Olympics. And her neighbors called the police and said, they're making a pornographic film next door and you have to come and stop them. So even at that time under the previous government, before the Taliban was in power, even in the capital of Kabul, this kind of attitude about this sort of gender separation, kind of gender apartheid that exists now, already existed at that time. So this has always been kind of an issue in Afghan society, this mix of very conservative people with people who have more progressive, liberal ideas, however you want to term them. And this woman on the left, Bibi Hakmina, she was an interesting case because she was a tribal leader. She had come of age during the war against the Soviets and was a mujahideen and fought in that war. And she always, because of the gender divide in Afghanistan, it's often the case that a family might not have sons, and so one of their daughters might, for a time, live as a boy in order to do work and different things the family needs to do, and they're simply not able to do as a girl, whatever it is, running errands alone, this kind of thing. And so in some families, girls are brought up as boys, and for practical purposes. And in her case, she just always felt more like a man, and now she continues to dress as a man. And I had to ask very nicely if she would have her picture taken without the Kalashnikov that she was normally carrying around with her everywhere. She's a tribal leader from Khost province, and she was just visiting Kabul when I took her portrait. But she was very impressive, I would say, unflappable, interesting woman. She's known in her province as the king of the women, Bibi Hakmina. So that's I think something which is a little bit outside the narrative of how we imagine Afghanistan, but it has these very strict gender separations, but at the same time, it's possible to somehow break the rules, and people will accept it. If it's within kind of the Overton window of Afghan society, which I think for Westerners is maybe hard to know where that window is. It's strange, because really we're very similar to Afghans, and we all have the same basic struggles in life of, how to survive, how to live a fulfilling existence. But at the same time, in Afghanistan, the culture and the history are quite divergent from ours. And so there are many things which I think Westerners find surprising there. And vice versa. I think when Afghans come to the United States, there are a lot of things that are really hard to get used to. Even for me, I would go to Iraq or something for 2 years and come back to New York City and be walking around in the fashion district in the middle of summer, and the culture shock is real. It's extraordinary, really, how the things like, sort of, I don't know, scantily clad women walking down the street to a photo shoot is somehow very normal in a place like New York City. but to someone coming from Iraq or Afghanistan, it just seems like something out of this world. Like you just can't understand what's going on and how it could possibly be permitted. So I don't know. I think for the United States to come to a place like Afghanistan and push the society in a particular direction actually had a kind of negative impact on the situation of Afghanistan now, because now that the Taliban is in power, they're trying to negotiate with the United States, but they don't really have anything that the United States wants in particular. And so the only thing that they know that the United States cares a lot about, because we keep on talking about it, are things like women's rights and women's education, girls' education, and these things. And so the Taliban is in a situation where strategically, in order to negotiate with the United States, the things that they can put on the table by removing those rights are things like women's rights and girls' education. So I think what I've observed about Iran in particular and Afghanistan, who in some ways these countries have a similar kind of culture, and Dari, which is spoken commonly in Afghanistan, is also sort of an older version of Farsi in Iran. There's a lot of cultural similarities, and they were at one time part of the same empire, in the same general cultural space. One thing that they don't like is to have outsiders telling them what to do. And this is common to both Iran and Afghanistan, and probably all countries, but in particular these countries. Iran, for example, has a 5,000-year-old culture, and it's very hard for them to stomach Westerners coming to them and saying, you must do this or that, and what you're doing in your society is incorrect, and you should do it this way. They kind of can't be told, and it's very much the case also in Afghanistan under the Taliban, that politically, the more pressure they're put under by the European Union and by the United States, Canada, sort of the Western powers, and the United Nations and all of this stuff, the more pressure they're put under to make specific policy changes in order to appease us, the harder it is for them to do that internally within the Taliban, which is a very disparate group with a lot of different ideas bouncing around inside of it. Like, for example, when I was there, as a journalist, I was there on a journalist visa for the last 6 months, and in order to get all the permissions and paperwork, you have to go to the foreign ministry of Afghanistan and talk to, there's this one guy there, Balki, who was educated in New Zealand as a high school student. So he has, perfectly passable English, and he's read books, in English, unlike almost all of the Taliban. Like he has a sort of secular education, and he says he told me he likes The Long Path to Freedom, I believe it's called, by Nelson Mandela, and he likes the autobiography of Malcolm X by Malcolm X, and these are the kind of books he likes. This sort of, and that's how the Taliban see themselves, really, as people who, like the ANC in South Africa, who were declared a terrorist organization. And at long last overcome this grave injustice. And especially this new Taliban 2.0, we can say the Taliban of now, as opposed to, say, the Taliban of the 1990s, it's a whole new generation. This is 20 years later, and all these young Taliban kids, they weren't even born at the time of the previous government, a lot of them, the previous Taliban government. And now, after this 20 years of war, they really see themselves as these liberation fighters who have pushed out miraculously pushed out these foreign powers who were trying to corrupt the culture and society of Afghanistan. And now they expect to be welcomed as liberators and heroes in Afghanistan. And they can't understand why people don't like them. I mean, as I said before, like nobody thinks they're a bad person, right? And I had that conversation also with this gentleman Balki, the spokesperson for the foreign ministry. In exactly those words. I said, you know, nobody thinks they're a bad person. And he's like, exactly right. And I don't think I'm a bad person either. And I said, yes, I know. And that's the thing. The Taliban really believe in their own goodness. And they even believe that without the intervention of God himself, you know, they wouldn't have been able to come to power so quickly. Before the United States even had a chance to leave. We find ourselves in this situation, I think, with our domestic politics, that the Biden administration doesn't really want to have anything to do with the Taliban government, especially prior to the midterm elections, because it's just political kryptonite. I mean, we've been fighting a war with them for 20 years. And so it's really unrealistic in a way, especially right now, to ask the Biden administration to cozy up to this government and, you know, do business with them. But on the other hand, this is really the only solution, because now the Taliban are really in power, and we've put them in power. And I think we have this dream, and I think we can look at it a little bit like Cuba, for example. You know, Cuba, after the revolution, a lot of Cuban property owners particularly came to the United States, were very unhappy to have lost all their property in the communist revolution. And now our narrative with Cuba is really dominated by this kind of right-wing narrative of the Cuban exiles. And so somehow we're just unable to normalize our relations with Cuba, and the Cuban people suffer because of this. And I think similarly now with Afghanistan, we're going to have a similar kind of problem, most likely, in Afghanistan, where we don't recognize the Taliban-led government of Afghanistan, and yet the Taliban government is never replaced with anything else. And because of our non-recognition and because of the sanctions and general sort of economic sanctions that we've placed on the country, the economy remains stagnated and frozen, and the population suffers because of that. After all, in these countries, you know, like Cuba or, you know, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, for example, it isn't the government that suffers because of these sanctions which are imposed by the United States. It's the people. The government lives like kings. And also, the Taliban are living perfectly well. They all have the latest mobile phones. They're all living in residential towers around Kabul. When I first moved to Afghanistan in February of this year, I moved into an apartment block that was, most of the other residents there were Taliban members of government. And so I would be in the elevator with the families of the Taliban, and you sort of, it's very intimidating, you know, you have to sort of like lower your eyes and, you know, make sure you don't get into trouble, you know, with the wives of various Taliban ministers there in the elevator. So, but they're all fine. Like the Taliban is not suffering at all. They will be the last ones to starve under this economic situation. They're the people the only people who are really guaranteed a paycheck now are the people who were fighters during the war. And this is just a kind of a realpolitik of Afghanistan, where now that under the previous government, it was also the case, right? It was a very corrupt government, because what would happen in Afghan society, if you're in power, then suddenly you have all these friends and relatives, mainly relatives, who are looking at you in your position of power, and they're saying, what's the point of you being in government if you're not going to help your family? Or what's the point of you having all this power if you're not going to help out your friends? And this is the way corruption tends to work in Afghanistan, especially under the previous government. It's not even considered corruption on some level. It's just natural. Like if you have this situation of power, you have to share it with your extended family. Otherwise, what's the point of you having power? The sort of national feeling is much less. And similarly with the Taliban, they also are in a situation where if they don't feed their fighters first, those people will say, we don't understand, we fought for 20 years, we won the war, we've kicked out those foreign invaders, and now, if we're going to be poverty-stricken, what's the point of that? So they're always going to be first in line for whatever money or food or WFP aid or what have you is available. They're always going to be the last people to suffer. So because of this dynamic, the only way that the United States can really help Afghanistan would be to liberalize our relations with the country and open up the economy of Afghanistan as much as we are able to from our side, which is significant because, as I mentioned, we have $7 billion of their money frozen in our bank accounts, for example. That money is intended to stabilize the Afghan currency, and at the moment they have, I think, 50% inflation of the Afghani currency. So, we're complaining about our 10 or 11% that we have here, but in Afghanistan it's much worse, coupled with the fact that their economy is completely frozen. No one can do business, no one can take out loans, no one can pay their employees. So the thing for the United States to do, really, with Afghanistan is to reverse this economic policy. And then, if the Taliban fails, then it will be their own fault. But at the moment, these countries like Afghanistan and Iran and Cuba can all blame the United States for their economic troubles and do so with some real legitimacy. This gives them a hedge against complaints from their own population about how they're running the country. Whereas if the West were to liberalize this relationship and open up relations with Afghanistan and stop preventing commerce from taking place and unfreeze the foreign currency reserves of Afghanistan, which, by the way, is money that belongs to ordinary Afghan people. The way it works is, if you're a business person and you have deposits in a bank, percentage of those deposits go to the Afghan foreign currency reserve, and it works similarly to the United States currency reserves. The Central Bank of the United States is the model for the Central Bank of Afghanistan. And it works in exactly the same way to stabilize the currency and to act as a hedge against inflation and so on. So we're really preventing the country from moving economically by freezing those funds. So if the United States were to say to the Taliban government, okay, we're going to recognize you, you're the government, and to all other countries, feel free to do business with Afghanistan, and we're not going to, we may have our certain individuals who are on our sanctions list and we don't allow to travel or we don't allow people to do business with them, but for the country itself, we are allowing all economic activity to take place. If we were to do that, then the Taliban would be in a situation where they were no longer able to really blame the West for their economic problems. And I think that would be a good thing, because then not only, I think, would the economy improve in Afghanistan, and we would no longer have to be giving as much aid as we are now, because Afghans are perfectly intelligent people and good business people, and they're able to build their economy in a more free economic environment. So I think they should be allowed to do that. Because also, there's another reason also, I think politically, which is, I think Iraq here is a good example. Because if you remember, if you're old enough to remember, as probably a lot of us are, Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, and we imposed sanctions on Iraq. In 90 and 91, the United States and the United Kingdom together imposed the most draconian sanctions against Iraq that had ever been imposed on any country. And we kept those sanctions in place until after the United States invasion in 2003. And our premise with those sanctions against Iraq was, well, we have to keep Saddam Hussein in a box, and by imposing these sanctions against the entire country of Iraq, we are going to put the government of Saddam Hussein under pressure, and perhaps the people will become so tired of these sanctions that they will topple the government. And of course, as we all know, that didn't happen. What happened was that we starved the population of Iraq. In the first couple of years of those sanctions, it is estimated by the United Nations that 500,000 children under the age of 5 died from malnutrition because the amount of food and medicine that we were allowing into the country was so minimal. And that wound up being our fault. And Saddam Hussein was able always, during that period, to blame the West for all the problems of the Iraqi people, correctly, because we had imposed these draconian sanctions against the entire economy, not only the government. So I think in the case of Afghanistan, it's going to be the case that the United States will say, we can't possibly normalize relationships and normalize our economic ties with Afghanistan because we can't allow the Taliban to reap the benefits of this normalization. But in reality, the only way that the Afghan government is going to, the Taliban government is going to come under any pressure to reform, and the only way that the economy will be transformed in Afghanistan such that maybe in the future it will not be a country that requires billions of dollars of foreign aid, is if the indigenous population, the Afghan people themselves, are able to develop their own economy and from an economic position of power, say to the Afghan government, we want these changes in policy, we want a more liberal government, and so on. When a population is eating from the hand of the World Food Program and under the thumb of an armed Taliban government, and there really are Taliban checkpoints all over the country. I've driven thousands of miles through Afghanistan, and there are checkpoints everywhere there. And it's really the case that the Taliban is Afghanistan firmly in its grip, and they're not going anywhere. So I think the United States is really in this position where we have to acknowledge this new reality and make decisions not based on our own kind of domestic politics, but on a real assessment of what will be beneficial for the population of Afghanistan. And take the fact of the Taliban government and sort of put it out of our minds a little bit and focus on the real interests of the population itself. I think that will be the healthy thing for Americans to do. To talk a little bit about the photography, and I hope we're not running out of time. And also I want to answer any questions you might have. I had this idea with the photographs that I was making that I didn't want to just have these portraits, but I really wanted to show people in context and to be able to see physically what Afghanistan is like and sort of have people moving within this environment. And the only way I could figure out to do that was to make these kind of huge panoramic images. And so instead of just going out and taking single photographs, I started going out and turning my camera on its side and making these pictures that were really stitched panoramas of, I think in each one there's 7 or 8, depends, photographs. all taken sort of overlapping each other, and then I just stitched them together in Photoshop. And it gives this, when you see them printed, it gives this massive impression of the whole area. So I can have a photograph that shows the sort of the way Kabul is built on these hillsides, and also have people within this landscape. And I became really interested in this particular way of making pictures. Of course, it presents all these technical challenges because you're not taking the entire photograph at once. You're taking it one piece at a time, from left to right across the field of view. And so, for example, if there's a kid running across the frame, suddenly you have all these pictures of him moving across. And so, just to demonstrate it here, when I actually made this photograph, there were twice as many of him. There were images of him in between the images that you see now, and I've just removed those and left these 3 because it's somehow a cleaner picture. But as you can see, I mean, the photograph is actually, it takes maybe 15 or 20 seconds to, at a minimum, to make the photograph. And so these panoramas wind up being like a little short film that plays from left to right. So this boy in blue, for example, he's running across the frame here, and you see him 3 times within the image. And it becomes really difficult as a photographer, just from a technical standpoint, when you're trying to do these complicated city scenes that have all of this movement within them. Like if I wanted to make this picture without showing, without showing the same person twice, to make it look like it's all photographed at the same time, I have to really be careful because there's all these people moving across the image. And so not only am I looking at the whole sort of frame, not just one frame in my viewfinder, but I have to consider the whole image, and not only that, but who's coming and going, and which direction are they moving, and so to make this photograph, you know, I've intentionally waited until, you know, the guy with the crutches is standing, you know, just here, and the guy with the wheelbarrow is, you know, here, and so on, and it becomes a much greater technical challenge to make these kind of photographs. I really I like these kinds of images of these kind of complex cityscapes because I don't know. When I was a kid, I really I liked this children's book author Richard Scarry. Ever Richard Scarry books? Because in those books it's always like you can sort of open the schoolhouse and see the children or whatever, the fire station or whatever it is, and and you can see all this detail happening, and there are all these different scenes going on. It's not just one subject, in a Richard Scarry book, and I like that a lot, and I really wanted to make photographs that were similar in that way, that there would be all of these different scenes happening in different parts of the image, and this kind of panoramic photography is really terrific for that. Because there are all these scenes happening on one side of the image which seem totally unrelated to scenes happening on the other side of the image. Particularly if the image if the photograph is blown up to a sufficient size, it becomes kind of mural-like, and for me that's really wonderful. I don't know. I think in order to do this kind of photography, you probably have to have a sort of autistic fascination with with a particular way of looking at the world. Otherwise, you just wouldn't take the time and trouble to do it, even if you can. And I think I have that also. And for me, a place like Afghanistan is really ideal for making these kinds of images because it's sort of endlessly visually exciting. It's something really new I grew up here on the San Juan Islands, and for me, and for all of us probably, you catch yourself sometimes like becoming used to the fact that we live in this extremely beautiful environment. It's easy to take it for granted and forget about the fact that almost 99.9% of the rest of the world is not quite as pleasant as here, and we forget about it. And suddenly you come back and it becomes new again, and you can see everything. And for me, in a place like Afghanistan, it's similar. Every time I go to a new country, it's like being a kid, and the shapes and the colors of everything are new, and the smells, and so for me, a place like Afghanistan is endlessly fascinating. You have these little, bakeries like this structure on the left with these, these hand-painted sort of, windows, and guys everywhere with wheelbarrows, with ox heads inside them, and I don't know. It's just sort of an endlessly fascinating visual thing. The way perspective looks for me is also very attractive. Things like staircases, these shapes within the image of the stairs on the left and right, these kind of shapes. Without these, for me, the picture wouldn't really exist. And I have to have these kind of architectural things and perspective lines coming in and out. And for me, this is something really exciting about this, making photographs in this particular way, especially these sort of wide-angle 2.35 to 1 aspect ratio images, are the way the lines kind of come together. And you know how if you're studying architectural drawing or something like that, you're always doing these images with different vanishing points, and I love that as well. And having this kind of panoramic view with the 24mm lens means that you can also see those perspective lines, coming out at you in a way that normally you take a photograph of something, you'll lose that kind of architectural perspective of things. But making these images, there's the kind of human drama happening, in different places of the image, but at the same time, there's kind of an architectural drama happening. And for me, this is, on a purely photographic level, the thing that makes it exciting enough to do for me is these sort of multiple vanishing points. This image has been cropped, actually. It was actually significantly wider than this originally, and it had 3 different vanishing points of alleyways coming together. I did a bunch of different takes of this image with different dramas playing out with the kids. Some of them reaching into these gutters to pull out their ball or something. You have this kid in the background with this stick, and you can kind of see, almost not see it behind this kid in the green shirt, this bicycle inner tube. And the kids in Afghanistan still play the stick and hoop game, which I think is, I don't know how old, thousands of years old game. It's one of the oldest games that humans play, where they have a stick and a hoop of some kind, and they're trying to keep this hoop from falling over and sort of wheeling it through the streets, chasing after it. And it's something, yes?
How many degrees of perspective is there? 180 or even beyond that?
Oh, well, you can make it as wide as you want, of course, but I decided to make everything a particular aspect ratio for this exhibition. But when I originally took the photographs, I was kind of doing like 180-degree or more angles of view. But it becomes the case that if you go so wide. It's true that, because printers now, in a professional printing press, they have rolls of paper, so you can really make a print as long as you want. So you could make these panoramic images that were just sort of, you could just you could keep on rotating around with your camera and make it, as the scene changed, you could just photograph the changing scene in 360 degrees if you wanted to. But eventually, it just becomes hard to print it, and you can never make a book of photography. It's already hard with an image this wide, to even show it correctly because it becomes too wide. So with these images, I decided to crop them down, all of them to 2:3:5 aspect ratio, which is like a cinemascope, like Star Wars. A widescreen movie has generally a 2.35 aspect ratio. I think it's really 2.4 or something, but people say 2.35. And so I just made all the photographs, all these panoramas, exactly that, those dimensions, because it's something that we're used to looking at, and it's wide, but it's not too wide, So I did it like that, and I think it works well. Like here, this image, for example, is cropped down. It used to be much wider than this. You can see these two friends holding hands over here on the left, walking toward the frame. And in the past, the photograph shows them also on the right-hand side of the frame, walking down the street away from us. So that's cut out of the image, the before and after. But time is passing also in this image. And I love these kinds of pictures because they have this kind of people in the foreground, but also these long middle grounds and backgrounds that kind of go off into the distance, and these roads that are sort of winding down into the city from the hillside into Kabul. And you can almost imagine yourself stepping into the frame because there's enough visual information that shows the environment as well as the people within this environment. And to me, this is the exciting thing. Like these girls are playing hopscotch over here, and they've kind of, with some kind of implement, they've dug the lines into the ground. Also with the buildings there the way they are, like this house made out of mud brick, the lines of the houses are also because of the perspective of the wide angle 24 millimeter lens that I'm using, things become a little bit curved, and almost none of the lines are exactly straight. But in an environment like Afghanistan, it kind of works because most of the buildings are also not exactly straight, and they also have in the streets and with these kind of mud brick buildings and the unpaved dirt roads, and you can see there's I think sort of open sewer kind of flowing down from the right hand side of the image down the hill. These kind of
On the last slide, there's a little boy walking up the stairs. It looked like he was holding 2 jugs of water.
Yeah, well, the little girl, yeah.
So I just was curious about what the role is in children. Do they have to do a lot of heavy lifting like that?
Well, sure. I mean, children are always doing errands of different kinds, and especially for those Afghans living up on the hillside, they don't have water, generally speaking. They have to go down, they have to walk down to a place where there will be a well farther down the hill, and there are these pump wells, and they will just, put their water buckets under the well and fill them full of water, and then walk back up to the house, and that's how they have water for washing and cleaning and cooking and things like that. No, well, I wouldn't say. So the question is about a difference between girls' chores and chores and boys' chores, and I think I don't think there's really a big difference. I would say that usually, like, girls are doing their chores with other girls, and boys are doing chores with boys. There's like a gender, like a divide, but there's not. But women are, like, out in the villages, women are harvesting the fruit off the trees and things like that, as much as the men are. men and boys. So, but definitely, like when I'm making a film, and you probably saw it in this 15-minute clip that we're looking at, it's just so much easier to film boys and men than it is to film girls and women. There just aren't the social restrictions on that, and especially like kids. Boys like between 9 and 12 or something like that. There's just almost complete freedom. They're not restricted at all. They can go wherever they want, and whereas girls, as they approach 12, 11, 12, they're more and more restricted, and they'll go under the hijab, under the veil, and have less and less freedom of movement. Especially now, but that was also the case under the past government. I mean, these photographs, of course, are all taken under the previous government. There isn't anything here from my last 6 months under the Taliban. But you can see here in 2013 or whatever this is that even in her own neighborhood, a woman going out to fill a bucket of water at the well is wearing a burqa. And this is under the previous government, this isn't under the Taliban. And this was totally normal, especially in a poorer neighborhood. A photograph like this, you really see kind of ordinary life in this kind of old neighborhood as it looks. And to me, that's kind of the value of a picture like this, is it's kind of opening up this environment and showing you a kind of documentary image of life happening. Nothing here is posed, nothing is being done for the camera. Mostly people are busy with their own lives and they're not really paying attention to me. And so I'm able to capture these little moments that are these kinds of slices of Afghan reality. And you can see these younger girls here, they're not wearing any kind of veil at all. And they feel perfectly normal. And even now, it's the case that you can see girls who aren't, they're not, at this age, not wearing any head covering or anything. And even now, under the Taliban, I have to say, there's a lot of talk in the media about how it's so strict now and how the Taliban is requiring women to wear the niqab, which means, only the eyes are showing. But that's not really the case, I have to say. I mean, in Kabul, it's not at all uncommon to see women who, they have only the sort of the least formal of hijabs, and their hair will be showing, and they'll be walking down the street with their friends in the middle of Kabul, and no one is saying anything to them. Without a male escort, without someone from their family, which is kind of the rule. The official rule is you should have a male escort, someone from your family, someone that you're related to, if you want to walk around in public as a woman. But in reality, you can observe in Kabul that this is not strictly enforced. And I don't know, it could be political, it could be that maybe in the future, if the Taliban get everything they want, that they will attempt to be more strict with these rules. But I think probably the opposite is more likely the case. Here, this is a playground in this same old neighborhood, and if you see the blow-up of this image, the print of this image, you can see all of the different small dramas taking place throughout the images, throughout the width of the image. Over here on the right, there's a guy who has wheeled a small ride for kids, and they're all paying, like one Afghani or something in order to sit there and have a hand-cranked merry-go-round going on. Fascinating things in a way. There are aspects of being in Afghanistan that are like, somehow like going back in time and, seeing things that might have existed here in the United States, 100 years ago or something like this hand crank merry-go-round with in the background you see the Bala Hazar, which is the historic, it's called the Bala Hazar, it means the high fort. And it's this ancient fort overlooking Kabul that at one point the British took it over, I think during maybe the 18th century. Now my Afghan history sort of fades beyond the 20th century. But yeah, these historical settings. The guy in the motorcycle has brought his kids as customers to be riding on this merry-go-round. But in the wintertime, this area becomes a big lake. It's all filled with water, but in the summer it dries out, and it's a large area where they play cricket and football. And here, I don't know, I love this picture because it has a kind of, I wish I'd made a zoomed-in version of it so you could more clearly see the girl there and this kid over, this sort of bandaged kid over on the right who's sort of standing there. But to me, especially with the clouds and everything, this picture has a kind of atmospheric feeling that I enjoy. It has a kind of cinema going on in it. And I especially love the textures of all the buildings because they're all kind of handmade out of mud, and they're all gradually over time kind of dissolving in the rain, and sort of changing shape. Like glass, eventually it will just sort of melt, out of our windows if we just leave it there long enough. And the same is true with these houses in Afghanistan. And the older they are, the more character they've acquired. And especially those houses that were there during the Civil War, they have, all this weathering and pockmarks from bullet holes and everything. Again, this is a scene from central Kabul. In the background, you can see the tomb of the kings, the royal family, which houses the previous the kings of Afghanistan, Zair Shah, and and his family. And in the foreground, women walking from down below into their neighborhood on top of this hill. And as you can see, the normal attire for women 10 years ago in Afghanistan was the burqa. And so, in a way, we're kind of kidding ourselves that we had women's rights and now we lost it. I'm sorry, but there was never women's rights in Afghanistan. Not during our 20-year war, and not now under the Taliban, and not under the previous Taliban government, and not under the Mujahideen government. The last time there was really an attempt to do away with the sort of gender divide in Afghanistan was in the 1980s under the Soviets, but it didn't last. And that was never the case also outside the cities, in the rural areas. This is a funeral for a soldier from the Afghan National Army on the edge of Bala Hisar. There's a mosque up here, and they're performing the sort of last rites, or not last rites, but I don't know what you would call it, but there's special services that are performed within Islam. You can see here in the distance, it's a little hard to see, but there's this red blanket up on the hillside, and under that blanket is the fallen soldier. The Afghan National Army, of course, lost tens of thousands of soldiers during the 20-year war, and they suffered enormous losses. Every year they would lose 10,000, 20,000 soldiers, I think, by the end of the war. And so it became just completely untenable. I mean, this is a population of only 38 million. So it's, almost 10 times less than the United States. And if you can imagine something of that, proportional to that in the United States, it would be, 100,000 soldiers dying every year in some war. it really, it really affected Afghanistan on all levels. And it was a war also that pitted brother against brother. There were plenty of families where some of the sons would be fighting with the Taliban and others would be fighting with the Afghan National Army. In the 6 months that I was there, the last 6 months, I drove around Afghanistan and I went to, mainly I visited orphanages where there were a lot of war orphans. In these orphanages now, there are all these kids who are kids of the Taliban, and there are also all these kids who were Afghan police or they're Afghan National Army, and now their kids are all orphaned, and they're living in orphanages all over the country, which are most of them now the orphanages of the population has gone down to about 1/3 of what it was under the war, just because all of the funding has dried up. And there's no way for those orphanages to feed the orphans, and so they just send them home to their extended families, where they work selling plastic bags, and they've lost their education now. But the country really is in very dire straits. I think 97%, I think, is the number I've heard more recently, of the country is living in poverty, and an enormous population, the majority of the country now, is food insecure. So again, I come back to the idea that the United States still has a responsibility. The United States is still very active in Afghanistan, even though we don't feel like we are. We still have an enormous impact on the country. And I think it's really critical for us to develop an awareness of what's happening there. And as a democracy, still, it's incumbent on us as citizens of the United States to be aware of our impact on Afghanistan and to really think about and discuss what we want our policy there to be and why. I think in the last 20 years, having our war there, it's really difficult, I think, if you were to ask Americans, what we're doing in Afghanistan and why are we doing it and how are we doing it. I think most of us probably wouldn't really be able to answer those questions very well during that 20-year war. And I think our media didn't really help to educate the population as much as it should have. But it's really important that we are educated about Afghanistan and that we let our elected officials know our thoughts on the matter. I think that's the only way it really works in a democracy. I've met people in government who were responsible for Afghanistan policy during the war. I've spent time with them. I'm under non-disclosure agreements, and so I can't exactly say, who or how, but I spent enough time with American politicians to know that on their own, they don't know enough to solve these problems. Or they might know enough, but they feel that the American population doesn't know enough to allow them politically to do the right thing in Afghanistan. And so I do think it's incredibly important, critically important, for us to be aware of Afghan reality in order to do right by the Afghan people, and at least not impose on the Afghan people unduly economically with our sanctions and our policy toward the country. Yes, I think it may be time for questions.
The clip I felt was very compelling, and I guess it wasn't the feel-good movie of the year, but any kind of documentary that asks us to look at our blind side and talking about it is worth it, I think. And with that being said, it's sort of the sanctions, what it will do to those thousands and maybe perhaps millions of people and children, but also it means but those sanctions also act against our economic well-being as well. So it's a dumb thing to do. I don't know.
Well, true. I mean, I mean, if I consider myself, I don't know, not, but I guess, I mean, if you want to look at it like, Henry Kissinger or something, in this really, like, realpolitik kind of pure strategic way, we are, in effect, ceding Asia to China, right, with our policy. Like, for example, Iran, we say to Iran, well, we're going to have these draconian sanctions against you, and we're not going to allow you to have, a civilian nuclear program or whatever. We have really hard economic sanctions against Iran, and Iran has troubles, selling their oil, and except to, China, because China doesn't care about these sanctions against Iran, and they probably don't care that much about our sanctions against Afghanistan. And it's quite likely the case that China will be the only country, China and Russia, really willing to do business with the Taliban government, and thus the Taliban government will be in the pocket of China. Because China is just infinitely more powerful and more capable of doing politics than the Taliban government. And the Taliban government, meanwhile, is aware of this. They're not all foolish people. And they're concerned about being in the pocket of China. And they would actually prefer to do business, as is the case with Iran, they would prefer to do business with the West, with Europe and the United States, than with Russia and China. That's the case. I mean, I spent enough time in Iran to know that Iran would really much rather have good relations with the United States than not. And the same is true of the Taliban. The Taliban really wants to have good relations with the United States, and they've said that they would welcome the return of the United States Embassy to Kabul, which of course is closed now. They want a normalization of relations. They don't want to be enemies with the United States. And they don't want to be forced into a kind of a relationship with China that excludes all other relationships. Pakistan, neighboring Pakistan, is already in the pocket of China. They have these major economic projects which are part of China's Belt and Road initiative. And as a consequence of that, you could say it's like a new Cold War between, it's no longer the United States and the Soviet Union. Now it's the United States really and China kind of. But yeah, it's definitely the case that that Afghanistan, left to the situation that it's in now, will be firmly in the pocket of China. And thus, this country, which people call the center of the world, will be, which has a border with Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and Iran and Pakistan and China, will be in the pocket of China, just like Pakistan, and it'll be sort of the greater China infrastructure. Yes?
Could you tell us something about either your favorite adventure or favorite people encounters that you had?
Well, it's hard because I love everyone pretty much that I met there. I always felt it was a little bit surreal, especially under the previous government, that I was able to be in this country which was in the middle of a war and sort of live a normal life. That to me is strange. I think people think about Afghanistan and it's terrifying, especially then, but also now. The idea of going to Afghanistan is terrifying to people. I was talking to my childhood friend on Salmon Island a couple of years ago, and he was saying, so you've been in Afghanistan, how do you even go to Afghanistan, right? It's such a strange thing. It's like there should be some sort of barrier that prevents a normal person from going there, but I was like, well, it's really easy. You just, you go to Seattle, you go to the airport, and you get on a plane, and in 14 hours, you're in Dubai, and then from Dubai, it's only 2.5 hours to Kabul. You just got on another plane, and before you know it, you're in Afghanistan. And just the idea of being able so easily to go from here, where we're sort of sitting in this wonderful, peaceful environment, to a place like Afghanistan so easily, and within 24 hours you could be there. Just the idea of that, like standing next to a cliff and you might lose your bearings and fall off of it, you know what I mean? It's just so easy to go there in the middle of a war, you know what I mean? And people don't think about it, but it's really the case that anybody, any of us, could just go to Afghanistan and take photographs or make a film or something like that. It's just wide open. Or you could, help out at an orphanage or something. And it's even more the case now than it was in the past. Afghanistan is completely opened up, and you can explore it in a way that hasn't been possible for 40 years. People used to go to Afghanistan as tourists in the 1970s. As I'm sure a lot of us know, there was kind of what was known as the hippie trail, coming from people driving their Volkswagen buses from Turkey through Iran and into Afghanistan, and then down through Pakistan and into India. And there was kind of this wide open territory. And in a way, now it's the same like that. Now the war is over. It's such a strange feeling to be in Afghanistan, and there's no war. In our minds, I think in the United States, we think there's still this war going on in Afghanistan, and that Afghanistan is this place where there is perpetual fighting, and there is, of course, still fighting in Afghanistan, but really in Panjshir. But when I was in Afghanistan, Panjshir was the only place that you could go where there wasn't this danger, because Panjshir was, very firmly in the pocket of NATO. The Panjshiris were on the side of the NATO forces, and they were the source of a lot of the soldiers and the military and the police of Afghanistan were coming from that Tajik population. Because in essence, what we did in Afghanistan was we took what was a civil war, mainly between the Northern Alliance, i.e. the Tajik and the Uzbek population of Afghanistan, and the Pashtun population. The Taliban are mainly Pashtun. And so it was kind of an ethnic civil war, a tribal civil war, between these different groups. And the Taliban had won the war, and we came in and said, no, we don't like the outcome of this civil war. We're going to reverse it. And we sort of pushed back the tide of the Taliban into Pakistan and neighboring areas. And we brought back this wave of of Tajik and Uzbek power and put these people in power. As soon as we got tired and left, then that wave reversed itself, and the Taliban just sort of came back in like a tide. But we were kind of holding it back all this time in support of one side of a civil war, in essence. One of my favorite things to do under the previous government was to go up to the Panjshir Valley and swim in the river up there. Wonderful. I don't know if you ever go river swimming, but in the river you can hear the sound of the pebbles moving down the bed of the river. It's completely different from swimming in a lake or swimming in the ocean, because you can hear the water is like alive. It's almost electrical, this feeling. And when you're in the water, when your ears are under the water, all you hear is the clicking, this kind of three-dimensional audioscape of these clicking stones rolling down the riverbed. And it's wonderful, it's this kind of stony bottom in the river of the Panjshir. And that was really glorious. But now, that's the only place really which is still at war in Afghanistan, and everywhere else is peaceful. Yes?
Taking the photographs, the Americans, we were for like 20 years.
Mm.
after 20 years. Is that the way you photographed it, or
Well,
did we do that? But no.
I mean, it's true that I didn't take it on myself to photograph American work projects in Afghanistan. But it's also true that there really weren't very many, especially compared to the Soviets. The Soviets went on a building frenzy. You know, when I was, I felt kind of like a fool because when I was in Afghanistan at first, when I got there, I would go to these different ministries, the foreign ministry, and and it would be this beautiful. This is in 2011, 12. This beautiful, marble building, and I would think, oh, we must have just built this. It looked like, who else? I mean, but in fact, it was all these Soviet era buildings. All the ministries there were built by the Soviets, except with like one. I think the Ministry of Defense. We built a new. I don't know if it's even finished. We had some. We spent a lot of money. But most of that money was not really spent in Afghanistan. Only, a fraction of a percent of the budget of the Afghanistan war actually went to Afghanistan. It was really only a few $billion, whereas we spent 2.5 trillion, I think, is the price tag of the war. So you can do the math. I mean, we spent billions of dollars on aid, but we spent trillions on ourselves, essentially moving that money from the public pocket into the pocket of private enterprise, of different contracting companies and different companies related to the Pentagon and supporting the NATO operations in Afghanistan. So most of the money that we spent never went to Afghanistan. And it was actually quite difficult to find sort of American projects in the country. There's no sewer system in Kabul, Afghanistan, after $2.5 trillion of spending. Right? There's no sewer system anywhere in Afghanistan. Basic things like that. We did build schools. Mainly it was UNICEF and the school where I filmed my documentary. In the beginning, they were in an old mosque courtyard, and then they moved to a new school which was built under NATO, the NATO period. But I think it was Japanese money through UNICEF or whatever that was paying for that particular school. UNICEF, the United Nations, a lot of United States money went to those organizations, but those are the organizations that were really building, schools and supporting clinics and things like that. The IMF, the World Bank. I think when the Taliban took over, I believe, don't quote me, but I think the number is $300 million in aid from, I believe, IMF was cut off at that time. And that was all money that was going to support different clinics and educational institutions and things like that around Afghanistan. So the budgets for all those hospitals and clinics were just cut off. And now those people, mainly in hospitals in Kabul, you could say the doctors are receiving salaries, but they have no budget for the hospitals. They're not receiving, they don't have medicine and things like that. So to reiterate, I mean, Afghanistan really needs their economy to function. And at the moment, it's easy for them to blame the West for their non-functioning economy. Are there more? Yes?
You said that women's rights haven't really changed.
Well, they have gotten worse, but they were never great.
Okay.
Yeah.
We listen to a lot of NPR and we'll hear like a story from a woman who previously was in Afghanistan and she taught girls music.
Sure.
And now she's chosen to leave.
Right.
Because
right.
she can't teach girls music anymore.
Sure.
So I was just kind of wondering your perspective, like what kind of perspective?
Well, right. I mean, some 100,000 people, at least 80,000 people have come to the United States, and I mean, it must be, a few times that number have gone to other countries. And of course, it's normal now to You're going to see a lot of documentary films, and you're going to hear a lot of interviews with those people who have left, because it's just a lot easier to interview them and make films about them. I'm making a documentary in Afghanistan right now under the Taliban, which I can't really talk about because of non-disclosure agreements or what have you. But I can say that it's not easy to make a documentary in Afghanistan. It takes a lot of time. It's just bureaucratically quite difficult to get all the permissions, and anybody can stop you, you know what I mean? Like, everyone is the king in Afghanistan. So, like, even someone quite low within a bureaucracy can just put their foot down and stop whatever you're doing. So you're always dependent on everyone. Yes. 5-minute warning. We have to catch a ferry after this, so our time is running out. So to answer your question, I think the people who have left Afghanistan, they have a legitimate viewpoint, but their viewpoint will be different from the people who are still in Afghanistan, I guess. And the people who have left Afghanistan are going to always tend to see the situation there as maybe even being worse than it is, because a lot of them left, during the actual fall of the government and during this extremely traumatic exit for many people. Like a lot of people who worked on my film also left at that moment, and all the news that they hear from their families and relatives is going to be bad news about the government and the economy and everything else. And it's hard to necessarily get a full, real sense of the atmosphere in the country. I mean, it's true, the atmosphere in the country is very muted right now. It's very, Afghanistan is very kind of unnaturally quiet, you could say, under the Taliban. But it's also the case that there's a whole side of Afghan society to which we've been blind, especially in these last 20 years, mainly because of the danger for journalists to get out of Kabul and go see something else. It's, in a way, not the journalist's fault. I mean, it really was too dangerous to go to most places in Afghanistan, or places where you would hear a counter viewpoint in Afghanistan. It's different. In a place like the Gaza Strip, for example, the Palestinians are very welcoming of foreign journalists because they understand journalism, and they know that their point of view will never be expressed unless they allow foreign journalists to work in the occupied territories. Whereas in a place like Afghanistan, nobody reads the newspaper, you know what I mean? There's majority illiteracy among, adults. There aren't, there isn't a culture of journalism. There aren't, people don't watch the news on TV. It's all the expectations that you have as kind of a Westerner, that people will know about cinema and they will know about journalism. All those expectations kind of fall apart, especially as you get out of the cities and into the countryside, into the villages. People don't know what a journalist is. No one has seen a movie in a movie theater. No one I've worked with there as sound, they've never seen a movie in a movie theater. I have to teach them everything about it from the ground up, including the physics of sound. People don't know that the sun is a star and that the earth is rotating around this star. I mean, the people I work with, people who have master's degrees in international relations, don't know the difference between Washington, D.C. and Washington State. So it's just a different level of knowledge. People know about different things than what we know about here. So a lot of the assumptions that we have about how things should work and all of that simply breaks down. I think we're running out of time. I would love to stay and answer all of your questions. Hello, yes?
So I know it's a drop in the bucket, but as far as aid organizations like Doctors Without Borders or Partners in Health, which ones have you found are somewhat helpful?
Well, Right now, all the aid is being distributed by UNICEF and United Nations World Food Program. But there are also local Afghan NGOs. And I wish I could right now, off the top of my head, remember the names and URLs of them. But in the article, the interview that I did for the Salmon Island Journal at the beginning of my photography exhibit, I remember doing my homework and listing those. So I can easily, if you buttonhole me, if you grab me after and give me some way to contact you, I will send you information about NGOs. It seems that we are out of time. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure.